A harsh thud echoed as Jordan Maxwell's suitcase was shoved down the narrow aisle by security. The business class cabin fell silent. A black man, 42 years old, dressed in a simple suit with thin-rimmed glasses, had just been asked to leave seat 2B, the seat he had paid nearly $5,000 for. "Sir, this seat belongs to a priority customer." The voice of Chief Purser Clara Hastings rang out, cold as steel. Jordan lifted his gaze. His eyes were calm, but his clenched hand pressed into his thighs until his knuckles turned white. He did not shout. He did not resist. He simply answered, each word pressed down like iron on the floor. "Valid ticket. Valid seat. I am sitting where I belong." Whispers broke out. A few passengers raised their phones, the lenses trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. The air in the cabin thickened, as if one spark would ignite an explosion. Across from Jordan, Edward Langston, a white man in his 50s wearing a navy suit and a gleaming Rolex, smirked. "2B is mine. I have sat here dozens of times. You must be mistaken." That smirk carried the arrogance of a man accustomed to privilege. In contrast, the calm in Jordan's eyes was sharp as a freshly honed blade. He leaned slightly forward, his voice low but carrying through the cabin. "Under Article 17 of the Federal Air Transportation Contract, seat ownership is determined by a paid electronic ticket, not by personal habit. Shall I read my ticket number aloud for the entire cabin?" The words sliced through the air. Clara faltered for a moment. Then she regained her composure, clinging to her usual authority. "Mr. Maxwell, if you do not comply, we will be forced to call aviation security." The phrase, "calling security," rang in the ears of passengers like a familiar bell. They had seen this before. A black man dragged from his seat, shoved along the floor of a plane. Now history seemed ready to repeat itself. Jordan drew a deep breath. Numbers flashed in his mind like a balance sheet. $500 million, the value of the deal he was heading to sign in Los Angeles. One wrong move and everything could collapse, but silence would mean surrender. He gave a faint smile, his eyes locking on Clara. "Are you sure you want your name in this report? You are attempting to forcibly remove a passenger holding a ticket paid with a black Amex card, while openly violating Section 240 of the United States Department of Transportation." Clara bit her lip. Never before had a passenger fired back at her with such precise legal force. Behind them, Edward burst out laughing, his mocking tone twisting the moment into a cruel spectacle. "Don't be fooled by some guy in an old suit, quoting laws. What a joke. I've been pampered by this airline for years. He's just putting on a show." His laughter spread. A few passengers nodded along out of habit, bowing to false authority. But many others began to shift their gaze. They started to realize the man in that seat was far from weak. Heavy footsteps echoed. 2 security officers appeared, their voices firm. "Mr. Maxwell, please leave your seat. If not, we will be forced to enforce aviation safety regulations." Jordan's heart pounded. The bright cabin light cast shadows across his face, his dark eyes burning with unshakable resolve. He rose to his feet, each motion deliberate, as though he were leaving on his own terms, not being forced out. To the passengers, it looked like defeat. But in Jordan's mind, the game had just begun. It would take one call, one name, and the entire airline would shake. Before leaving, he leaned close to Edward, his voice low and cold. "Be careful. The market does not forgive lies." The cabin froze. Phones kept recording. Every eye followed his silhouette as he was led away. None of them knew that the man they had dismissed was in fact Jordan Maxwell, CEO of a corporation worth $19 billion. And with one call yet to be made, the world would soon learn that the man thrown out of seat 2B was the one who held the real power. The airport corridor stretched long, lit by the cold glare of fluorescent lights. Jordan Maxwell walked between two security officers, his demeanor calm, yet each step fell heavy like a hammer striking the tiled floor. To outsiders, he was a man being dragged away in disgrace. But in his mind, a calculated move was unfolding. They led him into a small room, 4 white walls, a metal table, hard plastic chairs. No windows, only a tiny camera blinking red. The air was thick with confinement. Martin Doyle, a mid-level manager of the airline, 38 years old, entered. His shirt was wrinkled, tie crooked, voice hurried. "Mr. Maxwell, just cooperate. We only want the flight to leave on time." Jordan sat down, arms crossed. His voice was low, deliberate, sharp as steel. "You just said on time. But you forgot one thing, within the law. I am not the problem. Your biased system is the problem. And believe me, I know exactly how to deal with broken systems." Martin swallowed hard. He had never seen a passenger remain so composed, even after being forced from his seat. But before he could respond, Jordan pulled out his phone. His fingers pressed each number slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone in the room could hear. The line rang. On the other end, a deep, gravelly voice answered. Arthur Green, 68 years old, the largest shareholder of Atlantic Skyways, a man whose presence could shake an entire board of directors. "Arthur, this is Jordan Maxwell. I was just forcibly removed from seat 2B, a valid ticket. Everything recorded by dozens of passengers. The reason? Blatant discrimination. If Atlantic does not want a global media crisis in the next 24 hours, I demand immediate action." The room froze. The name, Arthur Green, landed like a bomb. Martin's face drained of color. The security officers glanced at each other, their hands trembling as they loosened from their belts. Silence held on the other end for a few seconds. Then Arthur's voice cut sharp as ice. "Jordan, you are still at JFK?" "Yes, and I want them to know. You just called me." Jordan ended the call. He placed his phone on the table slowly, letting the sound echo in the ears of everyone present. Only 10 minutes later, the door swung open. Stephen Clark, 52, Regional Director for the East, stepped inside. His gray suit was immaculate, his gaze sharp, each step pressing down on the air. He extended his hand, his voice polite but taut with tension. "Mr. Maxwell, I offer my deepest apologies. I am here on direct orders from Mr. Green." Jordan shook his hand, a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "I don't need apologies. I need action. And right here, right now." Stephen turned to Martin and the security team, his voice snapping like a whip. "Report." Martin stammered, fumbling a stack of papers with trembling hands. Stephen skimmed them, then tossed them hard onto the table. "No legal basis, no safety violation. This is blatant bias. Jordan Maxwell was forced from a valid seat while another passenger was sitting on a ticket for tomorrow." Martin's face turned ashen. The security officers lowered their heads, sweat beading at their temples. Jordan rose, his words firm, unyielding. "Return me to my seat, and let the entire business class witness it. I want justice carried out, in full view of those who filmed my humiliation." Stephen nodded firmly. "Mr. Maxwell, I will personally escort you." The door opened. Jordan strode back into the corridor, his head held high, his dark eyes blazing with the spark of an oncoming storm. The passengers in the cabin would never forget that moment, when the man once dismissed returned not as a victim, but as the very eye of power's storm. The cabin door swung open. Warm golden light spilled out from business class, where every eye turned instantly toward the man who had returned. Jordan Maxwell stepped inside, his stride slow and deliberate, each step pounding like a drumbeat into the chests of those who had witnessed him dragged out only moments before. Beside him walked Stephen Clark, the regional director, tall and imposing, his presence commanding immediate whispers from passengers as phone cameras flickered to life. In seat 2B, Edward Langston reclined with false ease, a glass of wine swirling in his hand. When he saw Jordan return, he raised his brows, his voice sharp and mocking. "What is this? This man was removed already. This seat is mine." Stephen advanced, his voice cutting like steel. "Mr. Langston, let me make this clear. Your ticket is for tomorrow's flight. Mr. Maxwell is the rightful passenger for seat 2B. A wave of shock rippled through the cabin. A woman gasped. "My God, he didn't even have a ticket for today." The blood drained from Edward's face, leaving it pale before flushing red with humiliation. He stammered, "That's impossible. I'm a regular here. Atlantic has always let me sit here." Jordan took a step forward, his voice deep and steady, each word striking like a hammer. "In business, what you just did is called fabrication, and fabrication always ends in collapse." The cabin froze, then whispers erupted, some passengers even offering light applause. Phone cameras locked onto Edward, the man who had fallen from arrogance to disgrace in an instant. Stephen did not stop there. He turned sharply, pointing at Clara Hastings and the two flight attendants complicit with her. "Clara Hastings, Meredith Hayes, Jason Hill. The three of you are suspended immediately. Remove your badges. Leave the cabin." Clara's face went pale, her lips trembling. We only followed procedure." Stephen cut her off, his voice cold as glass being sliced. "What procedure allows you to expel a paying passenger for personal bias? Atlantic has no such procedure. Leave." Meredith broke into sobs. Jason kept his head down, hurrying toward the door. Clara, once cloaked in authority, now stumbled out as a disgraced figure under the contemptuous stares of dozens of passengers. Meanwhile, Jordan quietly sat down in seat 2B. He fastened his seatbelt, opened his laptop, the screen glowing as though he were simply resuming unfinished work. But the entire cabin knew. This was no longer just a passenger returning to his seat. This was the eye of the storm, the center of power restored. A man in seat 3A whispered to his wife, his eyes fixed on Jordan. Who is he really? For the regional director himself to escort him? Another passenger replied softly, voice trembling. Not an ordinary man. Definitely not. Phones continued recording, tiny LED lights blinking. History was being captured, and no one in the cabin realized that within minutes, Jordan Maxwell's true identity would turn this reversal into a global earthquake. The business class cabin still buzzed with unease. The soft tapping of Jordan Maxwell's laptop keys seemed small, yet in that atmosphere it sounded like the beat of a drum. He sat composed, unnervingly calm, while the echoes of the three attendants being removed still lingered in the eyes of those watching. Across from him, Edward Langston sat flushed, clutching his ticket for tomorrow's flight as though it were his last lifeline. He muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. "No, this can't be happening." Suddenly, Jordan closed his laptop. The sharp click rang out, final and deliberate. He stood, his gaze sweeping across the cabin like lightning cutting through a stormy sky. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang firm and steady, "allow me to introduce myself. I am Jordan Maxwell, Chief Executive Officer of Maxwell Global Holdings, a technology and real estate conglomerate valued at over $19 billion. The cabin erupted. Gasps, whispers, the sound of phones snapping up to record. A woman covered her mouth, eyes wide. A young businessman breathed out in awe. "My God, Maxwell Dynamics. It's him." Jordan paused, his eyes locking onto each face, onto every phone camera trained on him. His voice dropped lower, but each word struck like a tolling bell. "Today, I paid for this seat, just like anyone here. Yet you all saw it with your own eyes. Money, power, status, all of it meant nothing when a system chose to see the color of my skin instead of the ticket in my hand." The silence that followed was suffocating. Many shivered. Some bowed their heads in shame. An older man muttered, "Oh Lord, the harsh truth." Jordan lifted his chin, his tone turning resolute, a declaration. "This is not just about a seat. This is an ethical test for an entire industry. If Atlantic wants to survive, they must admit their failures and reform now. If not, the market itself will pass judgment." The cabin erupted once more. A few began to clap, hesitant at first, then louder, stronger, until the applause spread through the rows, joined by a voice shouting, "Bravo!" from the back. Edward Langston shrank into himself, eyes filled with despair. The ticket for tomorrow's flight shook in his hand, now nothing more than a worthless scrap of paper. Stephen Clark stood nearby, his face tight, but his eyes gleaming with respect. He nodded firmly and answered in a clear, strong voice, "Mr. Maxwell, I will report this matter directly to the board of directors. Every crew member involved will be investigated and dealt with immediately." Jordan calmly returned to seat 2B, his movements unhurried, as though he had never been dragged away in humiliation just minutes earlier. He opened his laptop once more, the blue glow lighting his steady face, as if his powerful statement had been just another part of his day's work. But every passenger knew they had witnessed not just a dramatic reversal, but the moment when one man transformed personal humiliation into a declaration of justice for an entire society. The flight took off in tense silence, but outside, on social media, a storm was brewing. A passenger in seat 3C had already uploaded a 2-minute 47-second clip to Twitter with a simple caption: "A black man forced out of his rightful business class seat for a white, regular customer." Watch what happened next. Within an hour, the video surpassed 2 million views. Hashtags #Seat2B and Justice at 30K feet exploded, climbing straight to the top of global trending. On Facebook, a woman commented, "I went through the exact same thing, but no one believed me. Thank you, Mr. Maxwell, for refusing to stay silent." Another wrote in anger, "What era are we living in that this kind of discrimination still exists?" Skepticism also surfaced. One anonymous account posted, "He's a billionaire CEO. This is just a PR stunt." But replies flooded into counter, "PR or not, at least the truth is out, and the whole world is watching." Major news outlets jumped in. The New York Times ran the headline, "Atlantic Airways and the Ethics Test, when skin color outweighs a ticket." Forbes analyzed, "Jordan Maxwell, from victim of discrimination to symbol of corporate justice." CNN opened its live broadcast by replaying the clip, with the anchor concluding, "The question is no longer who was right or wrong, but how long it will take corporations to finally erase prejudice embedded in their systems." On Wall Street, Atlantic's stock plummeted. In a single trading session, market value evaporated by 12%, wiping out billions of dollars. In a worn apartment in Manchester, Marion Maxwell, Jordan's mother, quietly wiped her tears as she saw her son on television. She remembered the little boy once mocked for daring to dream of owning a bank. Now that same boy was forcing an entire industry to face the truth. In law school lecture halls, students passed the clip around, calling it the most vivid case study ever on aviation law and civil rights. Economics students debated, "This proves that ethics can move markets." At Maxwell Global Holdings headquarters, employees gathered around a large screen. A young assistant broke down in tears. "He's not just defending his personal rights, he's changing the entire system." Yet public opinion was not entirely one-sided. Conservative groups pushed back. If he really wanted equality, why flaunt that he's a CEO? Jordan read it all. He was not angry. He only smiled faintly. He knew every revolution has its detractors. What mattered was not having everyone on his side, but that the majority had seen the truth. That afternoon, Jordan's phone rang. Stephen Clark's urgent voice came through the line. "Mr. Maxwell, the board wants to meet you immediately. They are ready to have you advise on diversity and equity policy. They are even proposing an honorary seat on the board." Jordan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The memory of being dragged from seat 2B, Edward's mocking laughter, Clara's cold stare, all came rushing back. Moments of humiliation had become fuel. He opened his eyes, his voice slow and resolute. "Stephen, I don't need honor. I need commitment. If Atlantic truly wants to survive, they must prove that fairness is not just a slogan, but a matter of survival." 3 days after the incident, the Manhattan headquarters of Atlantic Airways became the eye of the storm. Outside, hundreds of reporters crowded the entrance, cameras fixed on the building, banners raised high. Fairness is not a privilege, and everyone deserves their seat. On the 40th floor, the board of directors sat in a circle, their faces tight under the cold white light. On the massive screen, the stock chart blazed red, down 18% in just 5 days. More than $4.3 billion in market value had evaporated. The chairman, voice hoarse from sleepless nights, growled, "We have no choice left. Either admit our mistake and reform, or wait for collapse." Jordan Maxwell's name rang out again and again. The video of him revealing his identity on the flight replayed repeatedly, no longer as a scandal, but as a symbol. One board member said bluntly, "We need him, not just to calm public outrage, but to redefine Atlantic." In San Francisco, inside a private meeting room, Jordan Maxwell sat across from 7 of the airline's senior executives. Their eyes carried a mix of desperation and hope. Stephen Clark began, his voice weighted. "Mr. Maxwell, the board invites you to serve as senior advisor for the reform program. Compensation, you may name your price." Jordan crossed his arms, his posture as solid as stone. His voice was even, slow, but sharp as a blade. "You still don't understand. This is not about money. This is about survival. Atlantic will lose the market, lose trust, and lose everything if it does not change fundamentally. The issue is not me. The issue is the millions of passengers out there." He set a thick folder on the table. On its cover, bold letters read, "Diversity and Equity Compliance Blueprint." Jordan opened it page by page, his voice ringing with force. "This is the plan. First, comprehensive anti-bias training for all, from flight attendants and ground staff to senior management. Second, an internal monitoring system to ensure every decision is based on data, not prejudice. Third, an independent committee of human rights experts overseeing every process with transparency. This is how Atlantic might survive." The room went silent. The sound of pages turning was sharp, like knives slashing through the wall of silence. The CFO frowned, hesitant. But the cost, the time, and what if employees resist? Jordan cut in, his words crisp as steel. You lost $4 billion in 1 week. That is the price of delay. If you continue this way, the cost will be total collapse. Stephen glanced around, then sighed heavily and nodded. We agree. Atlantic will follow this plan. The following month, Atlantic Airways announced the program Seat for All. The promotional video was broadcast worldwide, opening with Jordan Maxwell's image, his deep voice resonating. It does not matter who you are, where you come from, or what you look like. A paid ticket is an undeniable right, and Atlantic pledges to protect it. Hundreds of employees lined up for the first training session. Among them was Clara Hastings, the former chief purser who had once opposed Jordan. This time she wore no uniform, carried no authority. When asked why she came, Clara answered softly, "Because I was wrong, and I want to start again." Within 6 months, an independent report showed that 95% of Atlantic's passengers felt the service was fairer than before. Competitors were forced to follow, launching similar programs to avoid being left behind. The media called it the Maxwell effect. Analysts on Bloomberg remarked, in the past, the airline industry measured success by quarterly profits. Now, they are forced to measure it by passenger trust. Jordan Maxwell read the news from his high-rise office in San Francisco as the sunset painted the city red. His assistant, Rachel Kim, walked in and placed a report on his desk. "Sir, the $500 million contract has been signed, but all anyone is talking about is Atlantic. You have become a social symbol." Jordan smiled faintly, not with pride, but with depth. He knew that sometimes history does not grant us the privilege of choice. It throws us into the center of the storm and demands that we stand firm. A year had passed since that fateful moment in Seat 2B. The world still flew, still spun to its own rhythm, but something had changed forever. On Twitter, the hashtag #SeatForAll was no longer confined to airlines. It appeared beneath the post of a bank customer when a woman was denied a loan because of her appearance. It spread to hotels when a family was refused a room due to unwritten rules. It found its way even into hospitals where patients spoke out. Fairness is not a privilege, it is a basic right. Universities turned the incident into curriculum. Law students called it the Maxwell case, a living lesson in civil rights in commerce. Economics students called it the trust quake of the market. In the press, a new phrase emerged, the 2B effect. At Atlantic Airways headquarters, the annual report for the first time carried a line that read, "Customer satisfaction, 97%. Revenue was up 14%. The stock rebounded strongly." But what shocked the media most was the leadership admitting publicly on video, "We were wrong. But from that mistake, we learned the right way." On YouTube, that video was shared tens of millions of times, with comments saying, "This is the first time I've seen a corporation issue a real apology." In his San Francisco penthouse, Jordan Maxwell stood before the glass, his eyes on the Golden Gate Bay. Beside him, Rachel Kim, now Deputy CEO, handed him a freshly published book. "Do you know, sir, they've just written one called The Maxwell Legacy." Jordan smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Legacy doesn't live in books, Rachel. It lives in how people are treated every day. If today a passenger can sit peacefully in the seat they paid for, without suspicion, that is legacy." In Detroit, his mother's old apartment still stood. Marion Maxwell, her hair pure white, held her son tightly in trembling arms. "You've come so far, Jordan, but are you happy?" Jordan gripped her frail hand. "I don't find happiness in money or prestige. I find it in the moment fairness is upheld. When a poor child receives a scholarship, when a passenger is called by their rightful name, when a black person is not forced from the seat they paid for. That is happiness." Marion's eyes brimmed with tears. To her, the boy once mocked for dreaming of owning a bank had turned humiliation into a global movement. The following week, Jordan appeared at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. Thousands of leaders and scholars listened as he ended his speech with a resounding voice. "True power is not in the number of shares you own or the seat you hold in a boardroom. It lies in ensuring that anyone with a valid ticket has the right to sit securely in their seat. If we cannot do something that simple, we do not deserve to be called leaders." The hall rose to its feet, applause thundering like a storm. Jordan Maxwell, the man once dragged from seat 2B in humiliation, was no longer just a CEO. He had become a symbol of turning disgrace into strength, of transforming a single seat into a movement for global reform. From the airline industry, the Maxwell effect began to spread like a crack running through the entire wall of society. In New York, another clip went viral. A black woman denied the chance to open a bank account. But this time, the crowd of customers stood up together, chanting in unison, "Seat for all." The bank was forced to issue a statement within 24 hours, promising to reform its service procedures. In Los Angeles, a luxury hotel was accused of refusing a couple a room because they were not dressed appropriately. When the video hit the internet, the very first comment was short and sharp. "Remember seat 2B." By the next morning, that hotel had lost 30% of its reservations. Even in hospitals, the movement echoed. At a medical conference, a young doctor told his colleagues, "We don't just write prescriptions. We decide who gets treated faster, who waits longer. The Maxwell effect reminds me every patient deserves their seat, their place in the line for life-saving care." The media called it the fairness wave. Major newspapers ran headlines, "From airline seats to bank desks, the Maxwell effect is redefining service." Financial Times. "One seat 2B can transform an entire system of trust." The Guardian. "Companies rush to roll out internal programs, right to service, fair access policy, customer equity training." All of them, directly or indirectly, bore the imprint of the Seat for All movement. In his towering glass office in San Francisco, Jordan Maxwell quietly watched the flood of news across multiple screens. Banks bowing to apologize, hotels losing contracts overnight, hospitals changing their policies. He did not smile, nor show pride. He simply sat in silence, his hand resting on an old photo. 12-year-old Jordan in a public library, worn shoes on his feet, 3 borrowed books in his lap. He whispered to himself, "At last, fairness has moved beyond an airplane cabin." In an MIT economics classroom, students debated fiercely. "We studied Adam Smith, Keynes, Friedman, but now we must study Maxwell. Not just the economics of markets, but the economics of trust." Another student added, "Exactly. He didn't change the law. He changed the way the entire world looks at fairness." Late at night, Jordan received a video call from his mother, Marion. Her silver hair glistened under the light of her old desk lamp. She said only one sentence, her voice breaking. "Son, from a single small seat, you made the whole world sit upright." Jordan nodded, his eyes glistening. He knew this legacy no longer belonged to him alone. It now belonged to all who had ever been overlooked, all who had ever been pushed aside. The plane landed in Manchester, the city's trademark gray sky draped over rows of old red brick houses. Jordan Maxwell pulled his small suitcase and stepped out of the airport. The damp chill rushed in, carrying with it the familiar scent of rusted iron, the scent of his childhood. The car took him back to the poor street where he had grown up. The cramped two-room apartment still stood, its walls stained, its roof sagging. Inside, Marion Maxwell, 65 years old, opened the door with trembling hands. Her hair was white as snow, her eyes still as gentle as ever. "My son," her voice broke. Jordan bowed his head and embraced his mother. In those frail arms, he was no longer the CEO overseeing $19 billion, but once again the boy clutching 3 borrowed library books, dreaming of a future no one believed in. They sat in the kitchen. The old wooden table was scarred with tea stains. The kettle whistled softly. Marion looked at her son, her wrinkled hand gripping his. "You've come so far, but are you happy?" Jordan looked around the room. Memories surged back, the sound of rats in the ceiling, nights when his mother stayed awake writing a few lines that read, "Jordan, study as though you are the last light in this house." He answered slowly, his voice deep and steady. "Mother, I do not look for happiness in money or fame. I find it in the moments when fairness is upheld, when a poor child receives a scholarship, when a passenger is called by their rightful name, when a black man is not forced from the seat he paid for. That is happiness." Tears welled in Marion's eyes. She nodded gently. In that moment, she no longer saw the boy once mocked for dreaming, but a man who had turned humiliation into a legacy for the entire world. The next day, Jordan quietly walked through his old street. People recognized him, rushing to shake his hand, to embrace him tightly. An old man said with a choked voice, "You have made us hold our heads high." A teenager shouted, "Seat 2B is no longer just your story, it is ours." Jordan smiled. He understood that legacy no longer lived in grand halls or global boardrooms. It was alive, breathing, right there in the poor streets where he began. Late at night, standing by the window of the old apartment, Jordan gazed out at Manchester's dim yellow lights. In his heart, one simple truth resounded. Legacy is not measured in billions, but in how we defend the seat of the smallest among us. The Grand Hall in Geneva blazed with light. On stage, thousands of leaders, scholars, and journalists from around the world filled every seat, cameras clicking non-stop. This was the World Economic Forum, where every word spoken could shake markets, even national policy. His name was announced. "Please welcome Jordan Maxwell." Thunderous applause erupted. He walked forward, steady in his stride, eyes bright under the lights. He did not carry the image of a billionaire CEO wrapped in power, but of a man bearing the legacy of Seat 2B, the legacy of fairness. Jordan stood at center stage, beginning slowly. "1 year ago, I was dragged from the seat I had paid for. They called it procedure, but in truth, it was prejudice. And from that moment, I understood. Fairness cannot wait. It must be claimed, defended, and turned into the standard." The hall fell into absolute silence. Thousands of eyes fixed on him. His voice rang out again, resonant as a bronze bell. "True power does not lie in the number of shares you hold, nor in the seat you occupy in a boardroom. True power lies in ensuring that anyone, from a poor child to an ordinary passenger, has the right to sit securely in the seat they paid for." He paused. The light poured across his face, etching every determined line. His eyes swept the hall. Then he lowered his voice, sharp and final. If we cannot achieve that simplest of things, then we do not deserve to be called leaders. A single beat of silence. Then the hall erupted. Applause roared like thunder, surging from the front rows to the vaulted ceiling. Many rose to their feet, voices shouting, "Seat for all," in unison. The next day, headlines blazed across the world. Maxwell turned Seat 2B into a global symbol, the Times. Seat for all, from a flight to a human movement. Le Monde. Everywhere, from banks to hotels, from hospitals to schools, the phrase, "Seat for all," became the measure of fairness. It was no longer used only in service, but in politics and in law. In his San Francisco high-rise office, Jordan Maxwell looked out at the sunset washing over the bay. Beside him, Rachel Kim set down the latest report, smiling. "Mr. Maxwell, Atlantic has just announced record growth. But what people speak of is still only one-word legacy." Jordan nodded gently, his gaze distant. He thought of his mother, of the street in Manchester, of Seat 2B. He whispered, "Legacy does not live in numbers. It lives in the day when no one must rise to demand fairness, because fairness has already become the standard." And from that day on, whenever an Atlantic aircraft took off, passengers sitting in Seat 2B often leaned to one another and whispered, "This is not just a seat. This is a legacy." In today's world of business and society, the story of Jordan Maxwell does not end with Seat 2B. It stands as undeniable proof that fairness is not an abstract concept, but the very foundation on which trust is built, the trust of customers, of employees, and of entire communities. Management experts often say, profit can make a company move fast, but only trust can make it go far. Maxwell proved this by turning personal humiliation into the spark of global reform. If you believe stories like this deserve to be shared, press like to show your support, and subscribe so you won't miss the next dramatic and inspiring chapters. And finally, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment with just 2 words, fairness, to affirm that you too stand on the side of what is right.